our job tonight is system diagrams, and we have already learned that Angel has brought Hot Guys Making Out, and
Yes.
Herman, you brought a version of Traveler, but I don't know which one that is.
It's the latest
The
Mongoose.
one.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And Ross?
I have Masks.
Masks, okay. And
Again,
then,
if you think this is the only game I've ever run, you may be right. So.
oh, I see, yes. And then, Moreno.
Kagematsu.
Oh, excellent.
Ooh.
Yeah. And then I have brought Marvel Heroic,
Cool.
and because it's a follow-up from the last seminar. And then Ulf, what game do you have in mind, perhaps, to bring?
Well, I need to learn this from scratch, but since the one I know play most,
That was my guess.
well,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
I figured.
Excellent. So we have some different games. I think that we can agree that there are some different systems here. And the idea of the system diagram is not to teach how to play the resolution. That's not what we are doing. Instead, we are looking at what values in the game change. So if you have something like damage decreases hit points, then you would have something that says damage roll and then a little arrow to hit points that go down. Or you would have hit points and then maybe you would have combat and an arrow goes over and it says damage over the arrow, something like that. We will find in many cases that these diagrams become very systemic, almost like a physiology or an ecosystem. And so sometimes they don't. But it doesn't capture everything in the role playing experience, but it captures the way things change, is the idea. They also can refer to lots of things. In one of my presentations in Carrie, the diagram referred almost entirely to the character's mental state. In Nine Worlds, it was more familiar. It referred to bonuses to your resolution and points to spend to affect changes and to improve your character. And then in let's see, Gary Nine Worlds, and then there's games like Primetime Adventures and The Pool, where they don't refer to anything in the fiction at all. Fan mail and the budget, and the pool dice and the trait dice in very little of in the pool. All of those refer to more meta phenomena of influence that don't really demonstrate a specific thing in the fiction. So they work in lots of different ways. We'll find the right way for each game. So the first way to do this is to identify for each game what is the most consequential thing that can happen to a character or to a player in terms of some identifiable game mechanic, something with a name. So what can actually happen to a character? In many games, it would be injury and death.
Should we just go around the table and just pick one for
so.
our games?
I think so. And then when we get really
I mean,
interested in one of the systems, then we will go deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I can start. There are several changes that happen, but of course we have the almighty level up in 13th Age, and that's a pretty big change and affects a lot of things.
Now in 13th Age, unlike a number of related games, the criteria for leveling up, I think, are pretty simple. So what is the requirements to level up?
They're pretty loose, actually, but in this game, which is a sort of development out from DD4 and merged with a couple of other things, you should level up roughly between every 12th and 16th encounter.
Yes, and so
that's
that's
a simple
and so
way
you
of measuring
basically
it.
have a number of encounters, and I recognize this from fourth edition, where you could count experience points, but really you suddenly realize you don't have to. So okay, it would say number of encounters.
Exactly.
Okay, So let's take a look then inside these encounters for things that can also happen. So think about those. There are a number of them, I think. There. So these can be thought of as smaller or extra for then levels. And they may be things your character acquires. They may be things that injure or remove your character from play. They could be anything like that. But what I'm looking for is what happens inside an encounter that also has some kind of permanent effect. If number of encounters and level up is the big thing, and then what are the little things that can change that in some way? Is it better to level up with lots of money, or better to level up with lots of items, or anything else? Or worse, to, for example, to fail to level up because you are dead. So I'm thinking of those other consequences now that are inside that. Now, for example, to jump to Kagamatsu, we have a somewhat different situation in which there are not separate adventures. So a whole different kind of context for these variables is created. So Moreno, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Kagematsu, the most important value of each character is the love.
Mm-hmm.
Each scene in the game, no matter if the character is successful or fail in getting some kind of response from the character of Kagematsu, the woman who is playing Kagematsu has to choose in her in her opinion, if the character in this scene has gotten love or pity.
Right. So excellent. So we can say each player is building up pity and love. Of course, that player doesn't know
Exactly.
how much.
The
It's
player
secret,
doesn't know the score.
Right. That's okay. But right now we are just looking at the fact that it is changing and that it must change. And this is an important point. This is the same as in 13th Age. If the character lives in 13th Age, but there's an inevitability to this that I want to show, that it has to happen in Kagamatsu. And in 13th Age, tell me more. Is character death very likely?
Yes and no.
Okay.
It's the players always, there's an inbuilt mechanic that allows the players to retreat pretty
Right.
much unmolested.
Okay.
But that always has a cost attached to it in terms of something they call like a campaign loss.
Yes.
It means that you actually fail on some bigger, larger campaign goal. So it has a cost of, yeah.
But unlike many iterations of this genre, you're not in deadly mortal danger every single encounter. So,
No.
okay. So, given that and being a little generous about that, leveling up is inevitable. You will, if you keep playing, you will level up.
Yep.
And so the same for love and pity, scene by scene, love or pity will be gained. So these can be thought of as very solid arrows. They happen in play. So we'll come back to some of the other parts. Let's find the same kind of solid arrows in your diagrams. And remember, Moreno's is scene by scene. Ulf's is session by session, or more. So those are pretty big. Your diagrams may be much smaller in scale. It doesn't matter. It depends on the game, the scale of the diagram within play. You'll see in a moment for Marvel Heroic, I'm actually using a pretty small scale compared to theirs. So Ross, how about you?
Yes. Mast is a relatively standard Apocalypse World game, as Vince was saying, and it has a advancement track. So you gain Mark advances. Is it? I don't know how it goes now. You mark potential, and when you get 5 of those, you get an advance, and you can pick a new or add them to your character, that sort of thing.
So yes,
that's relatively small scale. I've seen people do it like get at least 1 in 1 session.
So we have the collection of advances, but let's take the results of 5 advances as the real unit.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we do that, what we are talking about is the addition of moves.
Yes.
And as I think you explained before, the specifically the moves that involve transforming yourself into a more adult and established superhero.
Yes, there are
right
grown-up moves. So they're
exactly.
Not perhaps,
let's
they're not quite as aggressively awful and then grown up as they are in Monster Hearts.
Right.
Before, but there are
as Angel and I have been experiencing in painful detail now. But the thing I want to focus on, let's really get as the biggest, most consequential change would be the grown-up moves, I think.
I suppose the final change you have is you can retire and become a...
Right. Well, in many ways, we can think of that as a very grown-up move.
Very grown-up, yes.
So,
it's the kind of
yes. And in fact, that's okay. We can say grown-up moves or retire. But are those available to your first 5 advances, or do you have to go through more than that?
It's got the same thing where you have to do 5 of the simpler, more basic advances.
Excellent. So 5 groups of 5 advances before you can do that. Okay, so again, we have a fairly large scale of play, and in many ways, it's not the entire game, but it does provide a natural stopping point in many I would think in application. So we have so that's good. Now and again, I don't know about masks specifically, but my guess is that character removal in any other way is not very likely.
The kind of death is not really on the table, for example.
Got it. Okay, so again, now I think what's kind of interesting in Kagamatsu, I'm trying to remember if can you lose a character along the way, scene by scene?
No,
Okay.
never.
Right. Same.
At the end, the character can die, but only in the prologue.
Got it. Okay, so then we have Herman.
Yeah, Traveler, which is the biggest changes to your character is getting hurt in combat and dying, I think. There is no real character development from things you do in game. It's more downtime stuff. You can train and
stuff
get
you
better.
buy.
Yeah. Well, we will. That
and
counts,
there's
though.
And there's cash.
So I'm guessing that to train and to get more equipment, you need money.
You need money, yes.
Okay. So let's say that either you get hurt so badly that you die, or fail to get money, or you get money, and you can train and get more things. So those are the 2 alternatives for a given unit of play.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's great. We have 2 results: death, better, right?
Yeah.
Death or better. And this way is damage, and this way is money.
The other way is getting rich and getting better.
And there's no alternative. If you play, these happen.
Yeah, you can go broke, and you can still play and see how you can come back from that. And
sure, that's
of course you can play other types of campaigns where other things happen. It's sandboxy in that way.
But isn't it true in Traveler that it's really hard to actually, like you said, get better at a skill? That will take like 3 years of practice or something. So in reality, when you play, that rarely happens. You either get rich or you die trying. That's
my impression. And the option of saying your character could sit in their backyard and not worry about getting too much richer and not worry about getting killed is, I think, theoretically, well, I just don't think it's of much practical interest in talking about.
No,
right?
You could play more of a political game and see how if you can get more influence or not really get richer.
Is there a variable for that?
But
is there a variable?
The nobility game? Yeah.
But is there a variable for that? Is there an influence?
There's not really a stat for you. You could try and improve your social your social level, but there are no real rules for that, except for some adventures will grant you a knighthood or.
Okay, let's keep that in mind.
Something like that.
In my opinion, that counts as a form of
there's a stat
the
for
money.
it, but there's not really fast, hard rules for it.
Okay. We'll keep that in mind, though. That's a nice gray area. So we now have kind of a gray arrow that goes with the money arrow. We can call it social status. Okay, I hit. And
so in Hot Gas Making Out, I think the two main things that change over the course of the game is the level of emotional and sexual intimacy and the level of the threat to the romance.
Right. Okay, so there are two. There are some similarities to Kadomatsu.
The level of intimacy goes up and up through the game. The level of the threat goes up, but also it can go down. It can go back down, and in fact is one of the things that can make that happen is the level of intimacy. When it raises, it can lower the level of the threat, as well as there's only other way to do it. But that's the main one.
So by becoming more and more and more intimate, you actually decrease the threat.
Yes, because of the power of love, basically.
Right. Okay. The couple is increasing can increase their love and intimacy, or whatever they are.
Yep.
Is it two things or just one?
I think it's. Let me check. I think it's. Blah blah blah. The script. No, here. Increase the emotional intimacy of the relationship. Increase the physical intimacy of the relationship. So I think it's kind of related, but there is that distinction. Right. One character can increase the emotional intimacy, and the other the physical intimacy.
Right. And so then these operate as a defense against some kind of the external threat that they will encounter as well. So there's some interaction there. We won't do it right now, but if you could, while we're doing this, review whether the physical and emotional have to go together or whether it is one or the other that protects against the threat.
It is both, and they can happen independently. And also it's interesting because there's no given levels of each of neither of them. It's really up to the players to define what increasing the intimacy looks like. So it's not like level 2 intimacy or anything like that.
Okay.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
The threat does have levels. It can go up to level 4. And when it's level 4, it can kill some characters.
Right. Okay. So with these in mind, now I will show you a little bit in Marvel Heroic. You might be surprised at the small scale that I have chosen to diagram, which is resolution. The reason for that is because there is an experience point system, but it is entirely elective, entirely optional. So if you go through the experience system, your character can improve, but it's not inevitable. It's completely optional and completely variable per character, and completely you can keep it very mild with just one small point once in a while, or you can go for the big version where you have a big climactic change for the character and you meet the milestone and you have to get a completely new method now for experience. So I'm not diagramming that because it is actually secondary. And it is important, but it is definitely its own little diagram over to the side. If you look at the file I have attached, it is the first of 4 files that I have about this game. So I thought I would walk you through it so you can see how I diagrammed it, and then we can go back to you working on your games.
Sure.
So if we look at, then the reason I chose this is because it is absolutely inevitable. To play Marvel Heroic, you must enter this diagram. It has to happen. So if you look at that first diagram, can you see it?
Yeah.
And you will see that it is kind of easy. There are just two roles that will be opposed. There is the player's role. There is the game master's role. The dice are pulled from the same kind of things from their characters. And so then, however, each one can be affected. The player can spend into the role, and the game master or the watcher can spend their doom points. They're called doom dice that you can do. Ulf, when I was talking about this system last week, I described it as very busy, as if you were trying to play Fate, Dogs in the Vineyard, and Shadow of Yesterday, and Primetime Adventures all at the same time.
Yeah, I own it.
Yes.
I played it though.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing, you'll see that there are actually two arrows coming from the Doom dice and the plot points, not just one. And that's because you can spend them to activate certain special effects for your character. You will see special effects over in the other box because some of them are free. So then some are not free. So that's why they're in two places. So that's the basics. But if you go and you look at the next one, which is called Opportunity, you will see some strange things happening at the same time, which is this is when you're actually looking at the dice that have been rolled. If the player rolls ones, then they become both new Doom dice and new plot points. So if I roll 2 ones, then I get 2 more plot points, and the watcher gets 2 Doom dice. So simultaneously, if the watcher has rolled ones, that permits me to spend more plot points than my ordinary one. So you see, now that has been added into the system. The addition, the influx of Doom dice and plot points. Then we finally have Then we have what I have there as post roll, that diagram. Okay, so now we are looking at the effects of the rolls. There is one of your dice called the effect die, and if you succeed in your roll, you really want a high effect. Well, now you can spend more plot points and more Doom dice to increase the effect by pulling in more dice for effect from your roll. Also, you can do something which you ordinarily cannot. When somebody is attacking you, you can defend, that's allowed, but if you spend a plot point, you can add an effect die to your reaction. So that gives you an extra attack a counter attack. So as you can see, these Doom dice and plot points are starting to become a little bit complicated before the roll, and then there's a conversion between them, and then how you spend them after the roll. To make life even a little bit more interesting, if you look at the last diagram that's called the Watcher diagram, you will see that all this time during the scene, the Watcher could have been spending Doom dice for completely different things that are pretty drastic. They can change the order of action so that they can bump one of their characters to the front of the order. They can change, the most drastic thing is to end the scene entirely. They need some pretty big Doom dice to spend to do it, but they can just end the scene and say, okay, that's enough of this. So as you can see, these plot points and Doom dice have this very complex relationship all the way through resolution. So this is that there's pieces of it that I have not put in, which is that you can, for example, change the size of dice with certain things. All the different SFX, special effects, are very complicated in what they can do to your dice pool once you have rolled it or before you roll it, depending. So as you can see, this is a pretty complicated little game of dice management and point management, spending before, seeing how many you get, spending after, a lot of it's very, very reactive. You have to make a quick decision about this at every little step during the resolution. So that's that situation. There are more complicated things for crossover to the experience points. If the watcher chooses to end the scene by spending 2 of the highest Doom dice, D12s, if he has them, he can end the scene, but the players get 2 experience points each when that happens. So you can see this dice management has certain outcomes for experience points here and there as well. So as you can, this is why I'm calling the system busy, but that's not really my point. My point is to show you that through the course of play, all of this is going to happen. You can, and then they will provide effects. You will see it on the post-roll part, where the real impact of the dice is to provide effects, typically stress, the creation of assets, the creation of conditions. And the GM can use Doom dice to change the environment, like suddenly have things catch on fire and stuff like that. So as you can see, these effects in play are also extremely important. To win a fight, basically, you stress everybody out, which is a fancy way of saying you knock them out or make them incapable of going on. So then there are other things about how to recover. If your character had an emotional breakdown, if your character was beaten into the ground or whatever, then there are other things. But they are scenes of their own and have roles of their own, which act just like these roles. So if you're going to play, you're going to be going through this. Somebody's going to be getting effects and conditions. Somebody is going to be achieving things, failing to achieve things, getting knocked out. It's very much a game about how the action looks right now. The experience point system has to do with decisions about your character, and you get small amounts of experience points for doing things that everybody would expect or that is very typical for your character, for that aspect of your character. And then there are bigger rewards for doing things that are more drastic, including the biggest, which is irrevocable, and you can't go back to this category again. So it's just like the Shadow of Yesterday. In fact, it's identical. So that's is everybody kind of seeing now what I mean by these diagrams, how it can be very focused down on pure resolution? Because in this game, that's where all the action is. So, and it's also important to recognize that it's running parallel to the experience point system with just a few little arrows crossing from one to the other, but not very much. So that's our system for this game. So if you look at the systems for your games and think about all the other mechanics, and in the case of Hot Guys Making Out and Kagamatsu, we have scene mechanics, correct? So things that are assessed per scene. Whereas in Traveller, I don't think that's the case. I think things are assessed somewhat differently. So therefore, you might have scene transitions in your diagrams, but Herman would not. So you guys getting the idea of what you could possibly start to map a little bit about how things get places? See what you come up with. So just the first scribbles are always wrong, by the way. So, or at least they are rough drafts. So, Ulf, I was going to ask you if you wanted me to help you identify some of the other pieces of your diagram. Like money or equipment, are those an aspect of play?
No. Okay. Money, no. Definitely no. We have something that is crucial to play, which is icon relationships and one unique things with the characters, but they rarely change, I would say.
Interesting.
Icon relationships could change, but there's not a lot of mechanics.
Right.
We should. Are you saying we should design our diagram now? I don't understand.
Yes. Start to draw some other arrows. How are think of what makes that love and pity change. There has to be a role in Kagematsu, right?
Yes, but that doesn't affect that.
That doesn't, but it has to happen.
Yes.
Okay. Right. So you could have a role and then say no, the judgment or something like that on the arrow. So I'm sorry, someone else was talking?
No, I was just saying I have a diagram that I did for one of my players actually to help him out with resolution in combat, because he built a fighter, making the simple mistake that he thought that would be an easy class to play.
Yes. Yes. Maybe.
And I could share that because I have that on
a good
PDF
idea,
here, actually.
But let me ask something before. I mean, the answer is yes, please do. But now, how do you relate that diagram to, or anything similar? If you did a diagram for a wizard, for example, all of those do they affect the big diagram? This many encounters to level up in any meaningful way? The retreat seems important.
Yeah.
Because if that would be an option inside the fighter's diagram. Yes. Is that correct? Yes. So the retreat seems important. So let's put another variable, which is the campaign. And so from each encounter, you're either going to be successful or failed for that campaign. Yeah. So that's important. That needs to be on the sheet. So there's going to be a number of encounters, and they will lead to a level up. But we look at the encounters to see if the campaign has been successful or unsuccessful for the characters as you go. So that's important too. So then inside each encounter is the decision whether to retreat or not.
Yes.
Perfect. Now everything you did for that fighter in that diagram is a little piece in that powers the decision to flee or not, or to retreat or not. So every player basically has their own little diagram, which will influence whether the group retreats or stays in the fight.
Yep.
So that's a good way to look at it. Think of them as the little engines, right? Inside. Ross, how's it going?
Yes. Scribbled lots of things.
Yes. Oh, excellent. One of the interesting things about Apocalypse World is that the way you get advances, you have to use the attribute that everyone else has chosen for you.
This one is just you get you mark potential when you fail a roll.
Right. So that's very similar to Monster Hearts. And so
but there is a bit of a similar thing to highlighting in the sense that the scores you use, the labels that you roll, are a bit more prone to changing than they are in Monster Hearts or Apocalypse World. And one of the ways they change is that people, I'm going to keep talking, though Ron looks like he's frozen. People can tell you how you should be or how the world works, and then shift your labels around so that your scores change. So, which is kind of a bit like highlighting in the sense of
you have your scores changing a little bit more flexibly. Yes. But does that have anything to do with advances, or is that a completely different system?
It ties into it a bit, in the sense that some of the advances are to do with freezing your scores or increasing them more generally.
Right.
So you can say no one will be able to change this score
right
anymore, or you can shift them up and shift them down because you take them in advance. But it doesn't feed directly into gaming, essentially.
Right. Okay.
Except insofar as if you've got a low score, then you make a move and tie to that score, you're more likely to fail. And
well, yes, but that's I see. Okay. So failed rolls effectively give you the advances. And then you have other things which can alter the scores, which I presume are other people's rolls and stuff like that.
Yes.
And then with lots of advances, then you get more moves and things like that. But you can also protect or fix your scores to be so they can't be affected. You also can go to the grown-up moves.
Yes.
Okay. So I actually, if I'm trying to harm, you said really isn't that big a deal. Is that correct?
Well, it's very temporary. So there are conditions, which is the sort of, harm it actually applies to people, but they're all kind of negative emotional states rather than you've got red line. So it's like you're angry or you're
despondent or something. Right.
Yeah. Okay. If you take enough of them, then you're out of a fight and have to leave the scene or go unconscious or something like that. And then there's actions you can take to clear them, no longer be that.
Right. Okay.
Have that condition, which are a bit like we said yesterday, and how you regain. You do some action, which is the equivalent. You're angry, so you destroy something.
Right.
Beat somebody.
Okay. So then in Hot Guys Making Out, Angel.
So I'm still midway through it.
Okay.
So one interesting thing I was thinking of is that there's this other kind of never explicitly addressed but very present factor, which is the tension in the game, like the emotional tension, the sexual tension, all of that.
Is that a variable, or are you just talking about the experience?
Yeah, that's very much just the experience of playing it. Mm-hmm. But I think I've played, and I think it's very present.
Okay, so this is actually an important point about these diagrams. We should recognize that they have to be accompanied with some kind of experiential commitment on our part. If I don't care about my young superhero growing up or failing to grow up, then I can't play the game. I'm just moving numbers around. If I don't care about the campaign, for example, in 13th Age, then it's really, I lose some of the experience of play. I lose some of the fun. And the same thing goes for all the other games. In Marvel Heroic, if I don't care about my how the action looks, then I'm going to be incredibly bored and uncommitted for a lot of the effort of play. So there are a couple of things. Well, one, we can talk about cost, the effort on your part to actually do these things. And then we can also talk about what Angel is saying, which is what is the nature of the emotions that come about because we do them, but in many ways that's backwards. We do them because these emotions can be brought into play. Mm-hmm. Right? So you can't really say which is the cause, which is the effect. The tension, is it caused by just the numbers changing? No, because they are just made up numbers. We have to care about it fictionally, creatively. Because we care, then we become interested in the numbers. So you can't say which one starts it.
But I do think...
But they have to go together as time goes by.
And looking at the diagram, basically, there was a big hole. Yes. And I think tension is the only thing that really fills it, because most of the mechanics of that happen in a turn do not interact with the threat or the intimacy.
Right.
Those are exceptions.
Yes.
They mostly interact to the tension, increasing it. And the threat level is like super increase on tension. Right. And intimacy both decreases the threat, and I think kind of resolves the tension.
I think this is incredibly important because there are two levels we are talking about. One is a atmosphere or emotional experience that is entirely personal. It is social, I think, too, when we share it with each other and we start to respond to each other about it. That happens in Kagematsu a lot. The way the players feel begins to be communicated across the players, and it becomes important. So that's one thing. The other are rules that happen not to be directly tied with arrows. And that's very important, because I think a game where every rule, every mechanic is right there in the diagram like a big swatch, is actually a pretty bad game.
Mm-hmm.
That there are rules that I think of as soft rules. And that's partly because they are completely optional, and partly because sometimes they have no immediate mechanical effect.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots and lots of examples. But a good example in Marvel Heroic is what I already mentioned. The experience points are a different... for example, you don't get extra experience points by having a high effect. You see? You only want a high effect in play because you care about that fiction of that high effect. But you don't get experience points for it. The experience points are for behaviors that could be in that scene or could not be in that scene. For example, there are characters for whom if you team up with somebody, you get an experience point. But if you betray somebody or betray your organization for them, you get more experience points. If you abandon the buddy, then you get all the experience points you can, but you can't go back to that buddy. That story is over. The rules for the experience points in Marvel Heroic are mostly pretty soft. They have numbers, but they are extremely, extremely voluntary. And there's, for example, no connection between getting the highest possible effect in your resolution and getting lots of experience. So that would be a somewhat simplistic approach, that if you get the highest possible effect by managing all your plot points just right, then you would get more experience. We can think of games that are like that. But in this game, the experience point system is mostly set aside and is completely dramatic and personal, as opposed to all of the super action of fighting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they don't force them together. They let that one take care of itself. And so that's why it's a softer mechanic in many ways. Then there are soft mechanics that have no numbers. And that's why I'm interested in those icon relations for Ulf. Because
they have numbers.
Okay, tell me about their use and what happens with them.
Okay, so in every setting, or in the default setting of the game, there are very important NPC characters. To make a parallel that everyone knows, if we look at Star Wars, they would be Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, and so they could be good and bad guys, right? And in the default setting of the game, it's the Emperor in the Dragon Empire, etc. So really big movers and shakers of the world. Now, when you create your hero, even if it's just a level 1 character, you all start out with some sort of relationship to some of these icons, they call them. You can have a positive relationship, you can have a negative relationship, or you can have a ambiguous, it's complicated kind of relationship that to be defined later.
Mm-hmm.
And you write a little bit about what that means story-wise, and then you assign a score to that relationship. And I think when you start a new character, you have 3 points to distribute, and you can select 3 different relationships, or you can pump all 3 points into just one relationship and make it really important for your character.
What do you do with it?
Now, what this does is that it gives the Dungeon Master a really cool tool to build a campaign around these relationships. Like, this guy hates that guy, or that character is in league with this guy and he's loyal to the Golden Dragon or whatever. And it also has a mechanism attached to it that you roll dice sometimes to do a sort of icon relationship check. You're supposed to do it at the start of every session. And if you roll a 6, you have some good points to spend, and that gives the player a sort of a hero point to spend to in some way affect the story, or get a bonus, or maybe find a magic item or something, as long as they can relate it to that icon relationship and make it meaningful for that character.
Now we have much more of a diagram than I thought.
Yeah.
You see, because
the thing is, that the relationship though don't rarely change. I mean, they rarely change. You get like one extra point at one point in the campaign, and that's it.
Here's what I see. I see icons with an arrow going to campaign.
Yes, definitely.
Number one. Number two, you have little arrows from icons to improvement or to resolution, encounters, inside encounters.
Yes.
Right, okay. Now we're going to look at encounters. So encounters, which are being affected partly in a small way by icons. Inside encounters is something, a diagram a lot like your fighter diagram.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where your little point from the icon relationship role might be going. Might be. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's a very slender line. Then we have, because they could go lots of places, it's a soft line. Then we go to the encounter itself, and we see that it affects the campaign too. Because you could succeed or fail relative to the campaign in terms of what happens. And then if you have enough, then you could have after encounters, then a little multiplier, like times 12.
Yeah,
and then
that's
that equals,
what I wrote down here.
Right, and then you have a level up over there.
Yeah.
And so whatever leveling up does, maybe it affects the nature of the encounters. Is that true? Once they are a certain level, can you do things with encounters with characters who are 5th level versus characters who are 1st level?
Yeah. You can up the resistance, of course, but yes.
But that's perfect, right? But when they level up, you have an arrow that goes to the encounters as well. So that's your diagram. Now we are looking at this, but notice that the arrows from the icons are very gentle arrows.
Yes.
All of the others are very hard arrows with big outlines. But from the icons,
they are usually when you try to use, because they don't give you, icon relationship rarely gives you straight up bonuses to a roll,
right?
Thing, but they will definitely give you give the player the sort of ability to say, hey, wait a minute, I think I know some guys down at the docks because I have a positive relationship here to spend with the arrow, things like that, right?
If we think positionally, where is that arrow going to go? It's going to go right to the beginning of the encounter.
Yes, because it will set you up for the encounter or change the ramifications of it. Yes.
So now we have two things that create encounters: the character's level and the influences of the icons in a sort of, again, optional way. So now I think we are looking at a much more clear understanding of 13th Age as a game. And when somebody says, what game are we playing here, in the very cultural meaning of the term game, this is what they need to know. They need to know its physiology. And I think, well, it's a good question. I often say that this is not what you give somebody in the beginning to learn a game. This is what you give them after they have learned some basic routines. Like the diagram you give for the fighter, that at least, or the some of the other kinds of things we could write, like the little combat turn sequence or something like that for some other game. You give them that. Now they just know what to do in the moment. But after a couple of times or one time, you can give them this and they say, oh, so this is how all those things actually work in the long term. Herman, what are we seeing from you now?
I've been scribbling a bit for, let's see, I just did if I can share it with you.
Oh, nice.
I started with credits, the money part of on the top left with all the arrows going out of it, which leads to trade, which generates more credits. So that's a circular thing, which can give you
this in this year of 2018. I think we all know how circular that really is. But go on. Yes.
But what helps with that is the location you do the trade at, the skills you have, the stats you have as a character or as a group of characters.
Yes.
So you need to go travel, either with a ship of your own, or take a trip somewhere, usually to another planet, to change the location to have more benefits there, and that costs money. There's training. Training leads to more skills usually, very slowly, but it still does. More gear, better ship.
And that's where you have your shipbuilding, your vehicle building, and your gear design.
Yeah, okay. The stuff on the side is sort of like mini games in itself. World building is something the game master will more do.
I would put world building underneath campaign, correct?
Yep, probably.
And then those other three go up there with gear. So that makes sense.
Yeah, and sometimes some players can be very happy building or creating ships from parts. Sometimes the game master will do it. Some people will just have a solo game of building worlds, building stuff, etc., having fun. Now there's the campaign. I briefly went through the book to see what did it say about it. You have a campaign, you have scenarios, you have encounters, and encounters is the moment-to-moment gameplay. More like that. And there's often the thing called patrons, which are sort of like little nuggets of someone you meet who has something for you, which gives you influence, which gives you money, and leads to encounters as well.
Now, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very interested now in the possibility of softer effects of the two kinds I was talking about. One are rules which are relevant to play, but are not connected heavily or tightly or automatically into the diagram, if there's anything like that. And then, and I'm not sure if there is anything in this version of Traveller like that. For example, is there a character type where they give you a little description of what this person is like? So is there a concept of how about status as criminal or legal? Does that matter? Things like that. Are they if they could happen in play, that's fine. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if they are mentioned, if they are part of the presentation of the game.
Yeah, well, Traveller is this weird thing where you have the play before play, where you make the characters.
Right, so they each have a history.
The whole career system, which happens before the play, and that has this version has a criminal career,
right,
which you can get into by rolling really badly on some of the other careers and getting into jail.
Right. Okay.
But that's
so
sort of that's more background than actual.
Still, though, there's an important part to this, though. What it means is that there is, if you ask the really crucial question, in what context do the characters begin this process? Then the backgrounds give an answer to that.
Yes.
And that's not trivial, actually. That's kind of important because they can begin play at a relative disadvantage. They can begin play at advantages of one kind, but disadvantages of another. And that will inform personalities. It gives you a very strong sense of jumping into play this character. And without it, imagine what everything you described would be without it. A bunch of faceless little drones just running around making money with nothing else. Why do we care about these people and their current and their travels and their finances and their, what they decide to build? It all goes back to the background when the character begins. If my character begins and he has just escaped from the mining planet prison, and I decide he's got this terrible scar running down the side of his face, and that's why he has that low score. I'm jumping in, and now we want to see what happens, not just what happens, but what happens to him.
Yeah, and this version of Traveller, more than the old ones, also has more of a system for in that part of the game to make connections between characters and perhaps to hook in some NPCs or.
Now we are talking. If we have some relationship rules in there, now we have the side soft systemic effects in which this harder system, these numbers that we are pushing around, actually becomes relevant.
Yeah.
And I think that's crucial. Without something like that, even if it is completely qualitative, and we find that when it has numbers, they are kind of softer and more voluntary numbers, or a little bit, there's nothing in Traveller that makes your character betray someone or something like that.
No, it's very much softer than the hard numbers you have there.
And so with that in place, though, that becomes exciting. Because in many ways, it's a risk. If I play and that softer and more atmospheric and emotional and historical sense of what is happening disappears, I, for one, would be very bored.
Yeah, for some people, the character creation system is the system.
Right.
I think Mark Miller, the creator of Traveller, ran some sessioning at GameCon, which was create a character and see if he survives the creation process.
Sure. Well, the interesting thing for me is to look at all of play, though. Let's say we want to play with everything. And I think you can see that they are complementary, that one without the other isn't as much fun.
Yep.
In Marvel Heroic, if you're just running all those dice just for colorful combat, it will get old and too much effort very fast. What they do is they provide all of the context, particularly all the stress. They provide the context for those other things, those other experience devices, the milestones, to actually have some context for why the character goes one way or the other on those choices. And so there is a dependency between the two, but if you make it too tight in terms of the numbers, then you're not playing your character. Then your emotional responses and your interest in the character is not engaged. It's not required. And I think that's really one of the most important parts of any role-playing system design. It's crucial. Just like those nice soft arrows for the icons in 13th Age. Here we have that character background and that relationship stuff in your version of Traveller. And people do not typically associate Traveller with airy-fairy, emotional, relationship-y drama. But I'll bet you that even the most hardened Traveller veteran would be bored if it didn't happen. Right. So let's see, for Kagamatsu, can you tell us a little bit more?
Okay. Maybe I should simply say that my dog ate my homework.
That's right.
Let's see if you can see this.
Yeah, that's good. You can.
It's flipped, I think.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, so only I am seeing this.
That's right. Yeah, we are seeing it correctly. So when you
the unit is the try. Each machine you can try different gestures as long as you are successful. You have two kinds of resolution, one rolled, one not rolled. One decide if you get the gestures and you lower fear by one. And you, I forgot to add that to the diagram. I think you unlock another desperation move.
Right, yes, that I know.
This is the rolling part. Not rolling part is the decision from Kagematsu if he gives you a point of love or actually nothing, because pity is not even counted.
Right. Well, this is all starting to make a little bit of sense, I think, because in the end, don't forget about your diagram, in the end, love has to roll against the fear.
Yes. At the end, the amount of you lower fear by rolling high enough, but you fight with a number of dice equal to the love.
Right.
So both end up in the end of the.
So this is actually a big deal. Now, Angel, I'm a little bit interested. What does end game for Hot Guys Making Out look like?
Sure. So I was just thinking about that. By the way, I just sent a photo of my diagram, which I have already found issues with. But
yes, first try always.
Yeah. So it's interesting because there's no hard rule for when to end the game. It's just when the conflict, when the threat is resolved, you stop playing. And there's no a specific condition to tell you when is that. It's just when the players decide that the conflict has been resolved, then you end the game.
Aha. At first, there seemed to be a lot of similarities between Kagamatsu and Hot Guys Making Out. But one big difference is that the end of the game in Kagamatsu is very, very, very hard, very mechanical. When it happens, it happens. The numbers will tell you it happens. Whereas in Hot Guys Making Out, that suddenly becomes a soft rule instead.
Yes, I think it is related. One of the ideas I had is that when the intimacy increases, not only decreases the threat level, which doesn't mean the threat is resolved, but also I think it resolves the tension. And I think when the tension is resolved enough, when you are like, okay, this is all fine now, that's when the game ends.
Yeah, because the group can no longer take the threat very seriously anymore. They just don't feel the tension. Right. So, Ulf, we just discovered something very interesting. In both Kagamatsu and Hot Guys Making Out, it is basically love against a threat. Love against a threat. Love against a threat. But in Kagamatsu, the ending is very mechanically determined. There will come a time when the threat will come and love will have to fight it, and we will see. And it is rolled and it is mandated when it appears and it is fixed. Whereas in Hot Guys Making Out, endgame is completely soft. There's no mechanical reason to say that the threat goes away, but according to Ángel, the experience of reduced tension, if you get enough intimacy, you have reduced the real person, the real people's tension with all this love. And so now that the real people aren't feeling so tense anymore, they don't care about the fictional threats anymore. So they say, you know what? We're done with the threat. We can finish.
Yeah.
So it's a very soft thing. But that doesn't mean it's not a rule. It is still a rule. It just isn't. It's kind of like there are these diagrams. They are not the whole physiology of play. They are the measurable physiology of play. You know, they are the most observable, the most easily measured, the most easily. If you look at people playing one of these games, that diagram is what you're going to see, because it involves physical motions and spoken numbers and maybe mathematical operations or something, and turns and things like that. Sessions. But if you go to the experience of play from the people's point of view, they are going to tell you that there was other dynamics that were important. There's a reason why she betrayed this guy right then. And you can see that in our actual play, in the games we are playing right now and seeing in recordings. You can see the importance of the mechanics, the hard mechanics, to the soft mechanics. And this is one of the things I'm really trying to teach in the consulting, but it's very hard. It's a hard thing to teach. Either people say system does matter and they want every goddamn thing on that diagram. Or they say, oh, it's all talking. Vincent says it's all fictional positioning. Oh. And all the numbers just become a bunch of bullshit and become meaningless effort, you see. And so the issue here is that we don't have, I think, really compelling emotional and dramatic and soft rules of different kinds. And don't get me wrong, sometimes the emotions can be hard rules. I'm not saying that they have to be soft. But we have decisions that are softer and more elective, more voluntary. And those decisions exist in the environment that is set by all of the harder and more solid and obligatory mechanics. And so this is actually kind of a big deal, I think, in the games. In 13th Age, I'm kind of curious about the more intangible aspects of a character's story. Will it ruin play if I change my relationships to my icons? Or is that allowed? Can it happen?
It can happen. I have even forced it upon players at times, used it as a tool when they did something really nasty, or as a part of the mystery when someone thought they had a positive relationship and I actually made them realize that they were betraying it. So you can play.
That's what I'm talking about, because they are voluntary and they completely depend on what has already happened, or else they won't make sense. You would never do it.
Yes. But if a player all of a sudden came to me and said, you know what, I don't want the gold worm relationship anymore, and we more or less base the campaign around that relationship thus far, that would sort of put a spoke in my wheel. Then I would have to really come up with a good reason on how to and way to change that.
That strikes me as a good example, though, of the breakdown of the necessary mutual commitments that make that part of play possible in the first place. It means something was miscommunicated or had failed to develop in the way that one would hope.
Yep.
Right. So, and that's another thing. All play is vulnerable. And a lot of people want to make play less vulnerable by making this diagram so completely deterministic, so completely unbreakable by these damned humans, right? And
pesky humans.
The pesky humans are going to fuck up my game. I'm going to make sure my game is invulnerable to them.
This game would be perfect if nobody would play it.
If it wasn't for the players. Yeah, exactly.
Well, you know as well as I do that there are game rulebooks out there that pretty much say exactly that.
Yeah.
And you are supposed to make somebody miserable if they do that. It's your job. It's part of GMing. Good GMing. Make them miserable if they do that.
Make them suffer.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that will teach them, right? So therefore we have a relationship between these diagrams content and the other decisions of play. And I'm not talking about completely unconstructed ones. I'm talking about things that are strongly implied by the game text or are even stated explicitly as options and other things to do. And I think that we can see this is why just going and following the resolution rules and moving the points around is widely considered to be bad play. And I don't care who you are. You can be as old school as you want. You can be as new school as you want. You can be as indie as you want, or whatever bullshit label you want to put on yourself. But everybody wants people at the table to engage with these harder mechanics, these explicit mechanics, but then to use them as context for the other mechanics, the other options, the other kinds of decisions, whether they have numbers or not. They are just not as attached directly to the diagram as its own pieces are to each other. But if you don't engage with that, then you are very much a beta presence at the table at best. You are really not communicating with anybody about the things that they want to communicate about. And so it's and I think this is one of the biggest issues with play is, when do you start to forget this? When do you look at the mechanics and you think you don't realize that somebody's going to do something with this situation, but it's not what you would have done or what you want, so you get upset, even though it was in their power to do this, And so there's lots of ways this can become very difficult to talk about. These diagrams, which are really fun to write, once you get used to them, I think all of you just realized how kind of fun it is to do this. And it's really interesting to compare them from game to game, because they operate about different things and at different scales from game to game. So that's great. But much more important is to say what else is happening because we are doing this. What becomes, do I care if my character is a good guy or a bad guy? Might or am I not? Do I care whether my character becomes wealthy and famous or not? Does that matter in this game at this other level of experience? And I think that, for example, if we look at anything published by TSR under the IP of Dungeons and Dragons, so I'm restricting D&D to that very specific category. Mm-hmm. And even that gives us multiple parallel tracks and things, but still, we're going to look at those. 9 titles, I think. If we do that, you will not see anything like that encounter effect on the campaign. You won't see it. There's no explicit statement that the outcome of encounters, particularly the character's decision regarding their own survival, affects how the campaign will go. And in fact, if you look at 2nd edition adventure modules for their fixed settings, it'll do the opposite. No matter what they do, the fucking story will continue.
Yeah.
Right? So it's exactly the opposite. So 13th Age, in many ways, you might say, well, this is, a D&D clone in many ways. Well, yes, except that it found something in one way to play D&D where the encounters matter to the campaign and says, this is everything. This is in the middle.
It's the hybrid.
Right.
The homunculus you were talking about.
Well, yes, exactly. You find a thing in the way we played D&D, and then you pump up that piece, and it becomes, the biggest organ in the body. But again, we're talking about that really hard diagram. Somebody else could say, oh, but you see, in my game, we don't have little arrows like that, but our encounters affects the campaign all the time.
Yeah.
In which case, that's fine. In their game, it's just a different looking arrow. Right. So that the question then is, when you design a game, there's no rule for what arrows, what things need to be this completely fixed diagram. There's no rules at all.
No.
And that's crazy. I mean, that's insane. How can you call it a kind of game when the actual pieces are completely different from instance to instance to instance? I'm trying to find some vocabulary, that there has to be some diagram like this, but there also has to be some kind of set of soft decision making and secondary systems that are actually experientially, arguably, the most important.
The actual game.
Yes.
But
in many ways.
That's never explicitly or present in the.
Well, it can be explicit. In many cases, I find that they say so in the text.
Yeah.
Right, but it's not hooked in the way
by hard mechanics.
Right. It's not hooked in. But what's interesting then is then you can take games which do have hard mechanics for things like love, like Kagamatsu and like My Life with Master. They do have hard mechanics for love. But you know what the mechanic is not present in My Life with Master? What does not have a number? Your hate. And is or is not your hate the thing that dictates and determines the outcome of play? When somebody rebels against the master, enough.
Yeah.
And there's only one way that's going to happen. And Paul swore up and down that he would never make it a mandatory part of play. Because to Paul, if that has mandatory, then it goes onto that diagram. It is a hard piece of the diagram, and you just killed it. He wants it as an emergent property. And this is what I was talking about when I talked about the fruitful void.
Yes, I was just about to mention that.
This is where the fruitful void comes from. In that, the trouble is that people, of course, made it a much more difficult discussion. They talked about how the most important thing has to be the fruitful void. Well, I don't know if it's the most important thing. All I know is that we need these tangible, these material, these movable items, right? We need these pieces. We move around and go up and down and get changed. But we also then see what other effects become easily understood and easily exciting in play when those other things are happening. And sometimes they are identifiable, like the experience system of the milestones in Marvel Heroic. Other times they are less identifiable, but they are often extremely important. In Hot Guys Making Out, Angel identified it immediately. It's the sense of tension, which Ben, the author, also, like Paul, said, I'm not going to make it a mandatory ending of the game. If you're playing and engage in this way, that will happen.
Yeah, when you play, it is so present that you cannot miss it. But in the text, it's nowhere.
Right. The reason Vincent called it the whirlwind is he was thinking of the arrows going around and around in these diagrams. And he was thinking explicitly, you can go back to his post. He was saying you can see the mechanics going in these cycles. And then he says, once the whirlwind becomes very strong, then its center is defined. Its center is defined. Then he says, that's where you find Ron's fruitful void. Now, I think it was a fairly good way of explaining it. Kagamatsu is quite interesting for this. Although the Kagamatsu player chooses pity in many cases for the woman, for the different women, the people playing the women have their own unspoken scores of love and pity for each other.
But there is no score for love for the woman.
Right. And so, therefore, it's very interesting that Kagamatsu's fate, if he fails and everybody's killed and the threat wins and Kagamatsu... I've seen games where everybody nods and says, yeah, this son of a bitch deserves it. because their pity for the women of their own, which they never wrote down, which they never kept score of, but they knew he was giving them pity.
There is another system where the player can declare that the woman dead.
Right.
This way they die to help Kagamatsu.
That's right.
That is a choice.
Yes.
You can say, no, let him be killed. We don't care about him.
My woman will walk away from all of this. Right. Or you can say, no, I don't think we gave him or he found enough love here. But I'm going to throw myself in there anyway. He wants to know what love is. I'll show him some love. I'm dying for
yeah.
Right. So that's exactly the kind of secondary system I'm talking about. And without those, and so you see, it's not a question of rules versus no rules. The rule that you can die for a Kagamatsu is a rule. It's an option and it has mechanical effects, but it is completely voluntary and it depends on those emotional contexts that are not written down. The things that are written down will affect them, but they appear inside the whirlwind. And so it's quite important, I think. For masks, it's a little bit interesting. Mm-hmm. I have my suggestion for what it might be for masks, but what do you think, Ross?
I don't know. It's different. So much of it is driven on a case-by-case basis for the different playbooks, because they kind of come loaded with lots of baggage, I think.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, yes.
And some of that is codified, some of it is like there's moves and things.
Right. Okay.
So you're a monster, so you're dealing with...
Pick your favorite one.
I like the Dooms, to be honest. I've never, but it needs long-term plan. Probably. They have a Doom hanging over their head, and then there's a whole separate advancement track they have of they do kind of awful, questionable things, and that advances that, and it makes it more powerful, but closer to
their Doom
to actually die, which is it becomes it's basically possible that a character gets killed off and like that. but time it still sits within the same structures and sort of what actually happens in the game in the fiction and the experience.
Right.
Like,
so
utilize all of it and get out of it. And,
right. Well, I think that makes perfectly good sense. And I was also the thing I was wondering about was about relationships with other characters, not with each other player characters, but with secondary characters. Mm-hmm. That struck me as one of the most important emergent properties of playing Masks.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I shouldn't have talked about the Doom. I should have talked about the legacy. I was just thinking about. Obviously, it has a whole family of.
Right. That's an obvious case. Right. And I was thinking about the example from. Go ahead, Ross.
There's some sort of technical score moves related to that, but I think it's as important that you have Dad come on the scene and really make you feel that character feel really bad about how badly they've done as being a hero, and they're letting the side down, and everyone feels really bad for them and sorry for them. And
if I agree that the one I was thinking of too was from our seminar about the Apocalypse Engine, where we talked about the hero. Was it that one? Anyway, in one of the seminars, there was the one about the hero who had he and his girlfriend were finally going to have the big night. And then there was the of course the menace had to come and attack the city, and that was the end of the big night. And so, but I was interested in do you role play?
That wasn't me. I've seen that seminar. Yes.
But how do you role play the romantic partner? I want to close. Does anybody want to say anything else about what they did or what they learned or what they think?
It was really interesting to actually get down to draw this thing. I've been thinking about this game for quite some time, and it really helped me clarify a few things.
Yeah. Herman, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. It takes an interesting look at how a system is put together and what's the really important thing there instead of the usual stats and stuff and gear and the like.
An enormous amount of what we
zoom
think
out a bit and then you zoom in on something different. And I thought that was very interesting.
I didn't say why I did choose Kakematsu is because it's the game that solved my two biggest problem with playing. I never see another game where the fiction counts so much. Ever the tone used in your voice is important, and nobody can make me BGM.
Right. Yes. Yes. Another interesting point is how some things that you might think of as not very important or too familiar or annoying, like cleric versus thief and things like that, actually play a more important part in these processes than one might think. Actually can be pretty powerful in that whirlwind and what you find in it. Don't let it become too familiar. Say, really, what inspires me about cleric? Well, I could be inspired by it if I let it happen and didn't get too contemptuous about the things that we thought it must mean. I can play it my way. I can make these other soft decisions, the way I want to. And then things will be a lot more interesting. And then the routines of when I cast my healing spells and things becomes a lot more interesting. And the same thing goes for Monster Hearts. That's what we are finding, right? That's what we are finding. We are saying, no, let's not just be a typical example of Monster Hearts. Let's just play.
But that's the thing. What I said on my comment, I don't think the problem is the typical example of Monster Hearts, because Monster Hearts doesn't care about that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's the things we bring to Monster Hearts that are not really there.
Right.
Really getting in the way, I think.
Let's think about not letting our own assumptions about either pop culture or gaming culture get in our way. We don't have to. We don't have to accept what a cleric is supposed to do. We don't have to accept what the vampire is supposed to be like. I think we have just enough time to say good night.
Okay.
Good
night. Thank you to everybody. I'll see you later.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, see you.
Bye.